Hey guys, it's Sarah from Just My Typewriter, and I have unlocked a new typewriter repair skill. So I bought this Remington 5 Streamliner model a couple months ago at an estate sale for about $25, and I brought it into my new apartment and just kind of left it there and forgot I had it. I then unearthed it for a cleaning video where I did a Remington ASMR cleaning video where I took it apart a little bit, did some air compressing, pretty easy cleaning, and I thought that was going to be all I had to do on this machine. Until I tried to roll paper through it, and I suddenly realized that this was a much bigger job than I originally had planned for. Now this is a 1940-1941 Remington 5 model. The Remington 5 model did come in quite a few body styles, including a more streamlined design, and you can tell which style of Remington 5 it is if it's labeled Remington 5 by the serial number and the letter that it starts with. I found my serial number on the comb above the keyboard. I forgot where that was on Remingtons and had to look it up, but I did then determine that mine's from about the 1940s and it comes in the streamlined style. Now, there is a Remington Streamliner, and this is kind of that in-between model that's a Remington 5 but designed similar to a Streamliner model. The original design for this was done by a metalworker named Oscar Bruno Bach, who actually has some work in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but he wanted to make a more deco style to a typewriter body and give it a little bit more of that streamlined look that we think of, in addition to still being a really classic, beautiful typewriter. What's cool about the Remington models is that these were made at a time where a lot of other typewriter companies were starting to whittle away parts at a machine to make it a little bit more affordable. So you were getting junior models and lower models from other lines like Corona and Royal, but Remington was throwing everything they could at some of their models and making them more of an investment than they would be from other machines. Something else really cool about this Remington 5 is the self-starter button. So this kind of acts like your tab, but it says self-starter, and it's advertised as being kind of an easier way to start paragraphs on a page. So it's a tab that goes 5 spaces over, and that kind of helps you start your paragraphs. But it is a really interesting little design feature on this already kind of jam-packed machine. It's got all the bells and whistles that you expect from a typical heavy-duty portable machine of this era, but done in a very classy and streamlined way. So the design of this machine is very much 1940s, and it is very much a Remington typewriter where they've got a little bit of a confusing mechanism to how some of the things work. It's different than any of the other machines I've worked on, and the Remingtons typically give me trouble, which is why I was worried that because I couldn't get paper through my machine, this was going to be a much more complicated process than it actually was. As I went through this typewriter, tried to feed paper through it, and it wouldn't roll through or wouldn't even advance with the carriage return lever, I realized there must be something wrong with the feed rollers, which are little rubber rollers underneath your platen that help grip that paper and feed it through your paper tray. So I looked at the back of this machine and I could tell that my feed rollers were flattened. This happens when you leave your feed rollers engaged or up all the time, pressed against your hard platen surface, and what happens is they just start to compress in those places, and it takes them from being circular to starting to have patches in their actual feed rollers. And this is what happened to mine. You can see here that it is not a consistent circular shape. Because it is inconsistent, anytime you roll them, you're not going to get consistent tension on your paper, which makes it impossible to feed anything through, and it makes it impossible to advance lines with your carriage return lever. Good news is, though, these are replaceable. And I found a really helpful tutorial, which I've linked down below, from Hot Rod Typewriter on how to replace these feed rollers using vacuum tubing from an auto repair part store, AutoZone. And I decided to follow this tutorial for fixing my machine. But the first thing you have to do to get to these feed rollers to even replace them is remove your platen. Now, over the years, I've talked a lot about different ways to take a platen out of a typewriter. I'm really partial to favoring the easily removable platens. They come out super easy. There's nice little levers on both sides and allows you to remove the whole unit. Royal typewriters are the ones that I started working on, and they're the ones I understand the platen assembly probably the best. They have 2 set screws on either side, but Remingtons are a little bit more complicated or maybe less intuitive than some of the other ones I've worked on before, so I did have to find a tutorial for that as well. Thank goodness Typewriter Justice, another typewriter creator here on YouTube, did have a tutorial for removing platens from a Remington 5. I've also linked that below. But the basic gist of it here is that your left side platen knob is actually screwed into the platen, so you can pretty easily remove that. Now these do get stuck over time, so you might need to soak it in a little bit of oil to loosen it up. But if you hold the platen, not the knob, the platen, and then roll your platen knob on the left side toward the back of the machine, you can actually loosen it from the platen and remove it, unscrew it all the way. On the other side of your carriage, on the right-hand side, there's going to be a little set screw that holds the right platen knob in place. You loosen that with a small screwdriver, and then you can remove your right side platen knob and the rod from the inside of the platen, and then lift out the rubber part of your platen. That should reveal to you your paper tray and your feed rollers. Now, in some models of typewriters, or at least a lot of the ones that I've worked on, the feed rollers are underneath that metal tray, and they're usually all just on one little metal rod. In the Remington system, these are actually designed a little bit differently, and it's not exactly the most intuitive design. On my Remington 5 and on Remingtons I've worked on before, this is actually held together in a bracketing system that's held by pins underneath the carriage. So what I had to do was tip my typewriter up on its back where the carriage is, move the carriage to one side or the other, and remove these pins that are holding in this bracketing system. I've done this before using a paper clip and just kind of nudging it out until I have enough to grip with needle nose pliers to remove this pin. Once these brackets are removed, you now have access to your feed rollers. Kind of. They're still kind of stuck in that bracketing system. So what I did was I took this whole bracketing system and my feed rollers to AutoZone, where I tried to match it to some vacuum tubing there in the store. Now, when I watched the Hot Rod Typewriter video, he had just a long piece of auto tubing, and I've had one of these before, but my local store did not have any just reams or rollers of auto tubing. Instead, they had these patch kits that have a bunch of different sizes of vacuum tubing for cars, and this worked a lot better for me because, as you'll find out, I picked the wrong size the first time. You can measure the diameter of whatever rollers or rubber you were working with, but in my case, they were so flattened that it really wasn't an accurate version to measure to get the right size of tube. So I took my brackets with me and my rollers with me and just kind of eyeballed sizes to make sure I had some options in this variety pack, and then went home to figure out how to get them onto these metal rollers. Now, the way the feed rollers are constructed is once you remove them from this bracketing system, they're a little metal core or metal tube with the rubber wrapped around them. Now, the rubber is getting really old here, so it should just kind of flake off. It does get kind of sticky sometimes. So what I did was I took my duck-billed pliers and kind of crushed that rubber off of the metal roller. This doesn't impact your roller in any way. You should be totally fine to do it this way. And then I scraped off any remaining residue with an X-Acto knife. Now, kind of like the Princess and the Pea and all the mattresses, if you leave any of that gunk on that actual metal tubing, you will see it pop up in your rubber, and it will displace some of your new rubber if it's left on the metal core. So you do want to remove all of the rubber and residue here so that you aren't actually causing any more issues or bubbling up in your rubber later. Once you've removed all of this rubber from your metal core, you can then measure out what size you're going to need of rubber to then slide onto this metal core. I again eyeballed it and picked one that I thought was the best or closest match. What I actually found was once I had matched those pieces together and put them in my typewriter, the rubber itself was too big. It was actually getting stuck trying to roll through the platen. So I then had to do this process entirely again and went just one size smaller. It needs to be thick enough to grab that paper, but not so thick that it gets stuck against your metal rollers. So what you're actually measuring for is the inner diameter, not the outer diameter. So I suggest here, or at least I learned, to go just a little bit smaller, a hair smaller on the actual rubber you use to replace whatever was on there before. Once I have the right size of tubing, I cut it down to the length of that metal core. I will have to cut this down smaller as I go through the process to make sure it fits in the brackets, but to get me started, I match it to the metal core length. The good news is that this repair kit had rubber that was about the size of 2 different metal cores. So I was able to get 2 pieces out of each of these patches, and I bought like 3 kits. Once I have it cut to size, I actually oiled up the inner metal core so that I could slide it into the new rubber, and I placed it inside a set of channel lock pliers so I could kind of compress it together. If I had like a little mini anvil or vice grip, I probably would have done it with that, but I just used these pliers as a replica vice grip to press them into each other. And because you are working with something that's smaller than your metal core, you're actually expanding the rubber as you're placing this metal core in there, which makes it the right size in the end, but it also makes it a little bit tough to kind of press them in there, which is why I recommend oiling up the inner core. Although it does make everything else slipperier, and I did have a slight accident with my channel grips that resulted in a scar on my finger, but we won't talk about that. I then did this same process for my larger metal feed rollers. These are a little bit longer, so I was able to get about 1 feed roller out of each of these patch kits. But once I had recovered all of my rubber, I then placed it in my bracketing system. Now what you want to avoid here is that any of that rubber rubs against the sides of your brackets, because that'll get it stuck and keep it from rolling properly. So I started to shave down the sides so they weren't rubbing on anything, just using an X-Acto knife and scissors. And this kind of helped me just trim out those edges. I know that in his video, Hot Rod Typewriter recommends, I think, sanding down these or buffing these down so that they fit better. I just cut them and crossed my fingers and hoped for the best. But once I had them to the right size, I was able to put them back in the bracketing system and put them back in the typewriter, pin it back together, and put back in my platen. Now, when you're putting your platen back into your typewriter, you do need to be a little careful. On the left-hand side, there is kind of a ratcheting mechanism which helps you advance your line 1 space at a time using your return lever. And this often has like a little metal fin on the side that you have to press down to get your roller or platen back into the right place. So I used a screwdriver to hold this fin down to put the platen back in before fixing my platen knobs again. And to put back on your platen knob on the left-hand side, you just roll it the other way. I'm sure that makes sense for everyone, but I had to think about it. Once my platen's back in place, I was able to test it with paper. Now, the first time I did this, the paper still didn't advance, and that was because the rubber I had chosen was the same size as the rubber that was on there before, but because it had flattened out over time, it actually squished out into the wrong shape and wasn't an accurate measurement. So when I moved down a size in rubber on all of my rollers, it worked much better, and now I'm able to feed paper through and use my carriage return lever to advance lines, and everything is working properly. Now, in order to prevent this flattening or splitting in future use, I do recommend that when you put your typewriter away, you disengage the feed rollers. Usually there's a switch on the right-hand side of your keyboard or on the right-hand side of your platen that raises and lowers your feed rollers. If you lower them and keep them away from the platen when you put it away, it will keep your rollers from getting that flat spot from being pressed against the platen. I also recommend that you just roll your typewriters every once in a while. If you haven't used a typewriter in a while, roll some paper through it or even write a pen pal letter just to kind of get it into a new spot the next time you set it away so that you're not getting any one spot on your platen or your rollers stuck in one place for a really long time. This is a good way to protect the rubber on your machines and keep it from getting any of those really annoying flat spots in any of the rubber that becomes then either expensive or kind of finicky to replace. The thing about typewriter repair is they're not making new typewriters, they're not making new typewriter parts, so anytime you kind of have to replace something, you're either going to be going to a typewriter collector who's manufacturing kind of their own new parts, things like typewriter feet, they are making new ones, and that's done mostly by collectors. But when it comes to stuff like rubber rollers or springs, we're either taking them out of parts machines or we're finding ways to adapt stuff that we do have access to already to be useful for our typewriter repair. So in this case, we're using vacuum hosing that is readily available at lots of stores, and we're kind of just adapting it to what we need. It's not a one-to-one replacement, but it is a manageable repair. So if you're willing to try it and be patient and follow tutorials and give yourself a little bit of grace if you mess up, you might be able to repair your typewriter for a really affordable cost and at home and gain a new skill like I did today. There are lots of great content creators here on YouTube that make typewriter tutorials and repair videos. There's also a couple groups on Facebook that might help you if you have any maintenance questions. Things like the Antique Typewriter Repair and Maintenance group on Facebook, the Antique Typewriter Collectors group on Facebook, and the Parts and Maintenance group. Lots of different ones there. And I've linked below those Facebook groups as well as the tutorials I used for this repair down in the description below. So if you have questions about those, you can always check out those tutorials. If you're interested in more typewriter repair or just typewriters in general, I have more videos on this YouTube channel as well as on my Instagram at just.my.typewriter. I want to thank you all so much for watching and remind you, you're just my typewriter. Okay, that's the third time we tried it. Let's go check the audio to make sure that worked.